delighted to welcome you all here on behalf of the Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies. I would also like to recognize the co-sponsorship of the San Francisco JCC, which is participating in bringing Adam Kirsch to Berkeley. I'm really very pleased to be able to introduce Adam Kirsch, whose work I've admired for a number of years. I have to begin by saying that I think he's a brave person, because he has been making his way as a literary freelance, which is not an easy thing to do. I'm sure he can attest. That is, he has published reviews and articles in a wide variety of very prominent journals. The New Republic, where he was the senior editor, I think these days we have to say the New Republic of Blessed Memory, and the Times Literary Supplement, the New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, the online journal Tablet, which is formerly associated, and other platforms. Although he's not quite 40, he's been extraordinarily prolific, produced at least I think more than half a dozen books. His third volume of poetry has just appeared. He has a book on Benjamin Disraeli, a book on 6 American poets, and a very interesting book called Why Trilling Matters, about Lionel Trilling, the great literary critic of mid-century, who taught at Columbia and actually was my teacher when I was an undergraduate. And I think that the book on Trilling says a lot about Adam Kirsch, because he talks about the way in which Trilling's engagement in literature was not a conventional academic engagement. It didn't have a methodology like the American New Critics, and it didn't involve a vast apparatus of scholarship, but it was a kind of ongoing searching reflection about what literature tells us about ourselves, about our politics, about our morality, and so forth. And that, I think, is one of the virtues of Adam Kirsch's work. And in that connection, I would also strongly recommend a very recent collection of his essays, Rockets and Lightship, which addresses a very broad variety of writers and thinkers, debunking some who need debunking, which used to be a specialty, I think, of the New Republic. I participated in that, and praising and finding the virtues in those who have the virtues. So, with that, I'm going to yield the rostrum to Adam Kirsch, and let us welcome him.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm honored by it and by the invitation to be here tonight. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you all for coming. As you saw probably in the posters, my topic tonight is a limited one. Is there such a thing as Jewish literature? And at first this might sound like just a rhetorical question, because the answer is obvious. If you go into any bookstore, you'll find overflowing shelves of books by and about Jews, not just in the Judaica section, but also in poetry, fiction, history, all over. No wonder Jews take pride in thinking of themselves as the people of the book. That designation actually originates in Islam, where the Quran refers to Jews and Christians as peoples of the book, because they possess a pre-Quranic scripture, unlike pagans who are ignorant. But modern Jews have taken it over as a peculiarly fitting description, a term of pride, as though Jewish culture has a special affinity for books. as though reading and writing are in some sense constitutive of Jewish identity. That's the argument made by the novelist Amos Oz and his daughter, the historian Fania Oz Salzberg, who I believe is going to be here in a couple of days, in their recent book called Jews and Words. Judaism, they write in that book, is not just a creed. It's not just something you believe in, and it's not just a set of principles, and it's not just a genetic relationship or an ethnic identity. What defines Jewishness, they believe, is a special relationship to texts. Jewish children, they write, were made to inherit not only a faith, not only a collective fate, not only the irreversible mark of circumcision, but also the formative stamp of a library. Jewish continuity has always hinged on uttered and written words, on an expanding maze of interpretations, debates, and disagreements. Ours is not a bloodline, but a text line. Of course, there's some self-flattery in this idea. Every culture has its books. Some have literary traditions even older than the Jews. And that point was driven home to me by a recent exhibition of contemporary Chinese art at the Metropolitan Museum, whose title significantly was Ink Art, art made with and about the implements of writing. One of the most striking works in that exhibit was Family Tree, a series of photographs by an artist called Zhang Huan, in which he documents the way that he inscribed classic Chinese texts in ink on his own face. With each image, the characters grow thicker and harder to read, and the artist's face more deeply dyed, until finally his entire face is an illegible blue mask. It's a brilliant image of the burden of literary tradition. The inheritor of so many texts is eventually submerged by them, but also of the creative and transformative powers of tradition. The blue of the artist's face is an exotic and ambiguous kind of beauty, just as the soul, formed by 3,000 years of literary tradition, takes on a special distinction, one in which deformity and sublimity seem linked. Now, that was not a Jewish image, but it seemed to me that it easily could have been. Indeed, it put me in mind of a famous aphorism from Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Yaakov would say, "One who walks along a road and studies and interrupts his studying to say, 'How beautiful is this tree? How beautiful is this plowed field?' The Torah considers it as if he had forfeited his life." This is likely to strike a modern reader as harsh and puritanical. How could it be offensive to God to notice the worldly beauty of his creation? Now, the text doesn't really say that we shouldn't ever notice the world's beauty. In fact, there's prescribed prayer to say when you see a natural wonder. But Rabbi Yaakov makes clear that when the world competes with Torah study for our attention, Torah must win every time. In a sense, the sacred text is a more intimate and important reflection of God than even the world that God created. Textuality is the Jews' most authentic way of encountering the world. In her short story, The Pagan Rabbi, Cynthia Ozick offers a provocative fable on this theme. The rabbi of the title, Isaac Kornfeld, begins innocently enough by starting to notice the beauty of brooks and flowers, but he soon advances to worshiping nature, and finally he falls in love with a dryad, a pagan tree spirit, and even has sex with her. And Ozick writes, "Scripture does not forbid sodomy with plants." He's devastated, however, when he's granted a glimpse of his own soul as the dryad perceives it. He takes the form of a quite ugly old man trudging down a road holding a huge and terrifying volume, a tractate of the Talmud. Ozick writes, "His cheeks are folded like ancient flags. He reads the law and breathes the dust." A Jew is spiritually a scholar, wedded to old books, even when he thinks he's achieving communion with nature. Like the dyed face of Zhang Huan, the Jewish spirit is made of ink, not flesh and blood. When Kornfeld, his love thwarted, commits suicide by hanging himself from a tree, his widow sees it as a just punishment for his sin, which was to elevate the body above the mind, nature above text. "We are not like them," she observes, meaning the Gentiles. "Their bodies are more to them than ours are to us. Our books are holy. To them, their bodies are holy." For Ozick, being authentically Jewish means choosing text over everything, even over life itself. This is a shocking proposition, and she intends it to be, for she's confronting the modern Jewish reader with a conception of Jewishness that the modern world has rendered antiquated, maybe even offensive. Indeed, the harshness of traditional Jewish education, the way early training in texts rendered the Jewish student alienated from nature and his own body, was one of the main complaints of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. Chaim Nachman Bialik echoed this criticism in his long poem, The Talmud Student, Hamatmid, where he describes his fellow young scholars. When young, I heard these voices. I saw these mute toilers, brows furrowed, wide-eyed, pale-faced, as if begging for mercy. Each furrow and glance a strangled urge, a dead spark. They stirred my thoughts. Scalded, my heart recoiled. But remembering their cry at night, like men being slaughtered, I cried out, God, what are they dying for? Despite such ardent protests, however, Ozick insists, not so much pessimistically as fatalistically, that the Jewish connection with text is too deep to be erased by any political or cultural program of modernization. She's making the same point about Jews and words that the Oz's make, but in a more polemical and confrontational spirit. And perhaps they're right that the Jewish connection with literature is qualitatively different from those of other cultures, even the most literate and literary. The reason is that for the majority of Jewish history, books were not just one element in Jewish culture, they were the primary element, perhaps often even the only one. China's history, to go back to the example of ink art, is one of wars and empires and military heroes, great buildings, beautiful artworks, all the usual things we think about when we study the history of a culture. The Jews, too, once had their share of these worldly achievements. The Bible is our record of Israel's generals and kings and of monuments like the Jerusalem Temple. But the temple was destroyed by a Roman army in the year 70, and the state of Judea was abolished. For the next 1900 years, until the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, the history of Judaism would not be told primarily in political terms. It would be instead primarily a history of books. The major events of Jewish history in the diaspora are the books that influenced the way Jews thought, lived, and imagined. This must always be kept in mind, for books were the active expression of the Jewish people, the way that they expressed their agency and independence. Leave them out of the picture, and the Jews come to seem like mere objects of history, instead of history's subjects, the perpetual victims of persecution and expulsion. To know what Jews suffered, we have to learn about the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Holocaust, but to know what Jews did, we have to learn about the Talmud and the Guide of the Perplexed and the Zohar. For Oz and O. Salzberger, Jewishness is constituted by a particular relationship to texts. This is a hopeful argument, for it suggests that the form of Jewish culture remains, even when its content has fragmented. Today, Jews are divided between Israel and America, Hebrew and English, orthodoxy and secularism, to name just the most prominent lines of fracture. But we're still united, maybe, by textuality, the sense that reading and writing are the most authentic way of relating to the world, and by the premium that Jewish families have always placed on literacy and intellectual achievement. Jewish parenting, the Oz's write, had, perhaps still has, a unique academic edge. Being a parent meant performing some level of text-based teaching. The classic example of this ideal can be found in the Passover Seder when we read about the four sons, the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask a question. The wise son, the ideal Jewish son, is defined by his intellectual curiosity. What does the wise son say? What are the testimonials, statutes, and laws the Lord our God commanded you? And his reward is to be initiated into knowledge of Jewish law. You should tell him about the laws of Pesach, that one may eat no dessert after eating the Pesach offering. This is Jewish education as it's supposed to be, asking questions and receiving answers, passing along knowledge from generation to generation. The question that I want to ask tonight is whether that education remains Jewish when it has stopped asking about the testimonial statutes and laws that make up Judaism. Is there an identifiably Jewish style of thought, which marks its practitioner as belonging to Jewish tradition, even when he's not consciously engaged with that tradition. This question became a central one for Jewish culture starting in the 18th century, when the process of emancipation began. For the first time in parts of Western and Central Europe, it became possible for Jews to contribute their intellectual powers not to the traditional pursuit of legal study, but to secular subjects like philosophy, medicine, science, and literature. Just how exhilarating that change was for Jewish intellectuals can be seen in the remarkable autobiography of Solomon Maimon, who lived in the second half of the 18th century. Maimon, who took that name in honor of Maimonides, the philosopher who most inspired him, was born in what he describes as a miserably backwards Jewish village in Lithuania. He was a precocious child who displayed an early curiosity about all kinds of subjects, from painting to astronomy. Yet he remarks bitterly that all of these pursuits were forbidden by the traditional Jewish culture in which he grew up. In that culture, he explains, the only legitimate subject of study was the Talmud, and the only possible aspiration for a gifted boy was to become a rabbi. A gifted girl, of course, was not allowed to aspire to that. Maimon dramatizes his intellectual predicament with a story. I had from childhood a great inclination and talent for drawing, he writes. True, I had in my father's house never a chance of seeing a work of art, but I found on the title page of some Hebrew books woodcuts of foliage, birds, and so forth. I felt great pleasure in these woodcuts and made an effort to imitate them with a bit of chalk or charcoal. What, however, strengthened this inclination in me still more was a Hebrew book of fables in which the personages who played their part in the fables, the animals, were represented in such woodcuts. I copied all the figures with the greatest exactness. My father admired, indeed, my skill in this, but he rebuked me at the same time in these words. You want to become a painter? You are to study the Talmud and become a rabbi. He who understands the Talmud understands everything. The story Maimon tells in his autobiography is of his gradual revolt against this kind of intellectual discipline or tyranny, and his escape from Jewish orthodoxy and superstition into the fresh air of the European Enlightenment. This involved a difficult process of self-education, including teaching himself to read German, which he did by figuring out on his own that the position of the letters in the German alphabet was similar to that in the Hebrew alphabet, so that B made the same sound as bet and so on. And he found that out by studying the letters printed at the bottoms of signatures in books, not even out of a spelling book, but just from seeing the bottoms of books that he read. His introduction to secular philosophy came when he entered a shop where pages of a book on metaphysics were being used to wrap sticks of butter. He managed to convince the shop owner to sell him the book instead. Finally, after exploring spiritual movements like Kabbalah and Hasidism and finding them all wanting, Maimon resolved to leave Lithuania and head for Berlin, the capital of the German Enlightenment, and a place where Jews like Moses Mendelssohn were managing to find a place in secular philosophy. It took him several tries to establish himself in Berlin, and he spent years wandering from city to city, living on charity or else starving. In time, he did achieve the reputation he hoped for as a philosopher. His crowning moment came when Immanuel Kant himself announced that no one had understood his work better than Maimon. Still, cut off from traditional Jewish society and unable to make a place for himself in Gentile society, Maimon lived an unhappy and unsettled life, and he died early. In a book of reminiscences compiled after his death, his friends noted that when studying a difficult mathematical or philosophical work, he would instinctively fall into the traditional rocking and chanting he learned while studying Talmud as a boy. It's a poignant image of the Jewish intellectual translated into a non-Jewish context, yet never really losing the signature of his origins. He's a Jewish intellectual like Maimon, still doing something Jewish if he's studying Kant instead of the Talmud. Solomon Maimon would not have thought so. For him, the whole point of the Enlightenment was that it meant leaving parochial identities behind and joining the universally human. For him, Jewishness was not a resource to be employed, but a trap to be escaped. And certainly there are areas of intellectual activity in which the mind seems to operate independently of its biography, science above all, which is the pursuit of objective truth about reality. When the Nazis called Einstein's theory of relativity Jewish science, They were denying that basic objectivity, as if the reality observed by Aryans and the one observed by Jews were irreducibly different. So there's something actually deeply problematic about the idea that it's possible to be Jewish in form, in style, in habit and manner of thought, without actually being Jewish in content and subject matter. If a mind is trained to study Talmud, we have no problem calling it a Jewish mind. If a mind is trained to study physics and it happens to belong to a Jew, is it still a Jewish mind? Or to take another example, what about if the mind is that of a composer? Look back for a moment at Moses Mendelssohn, who I mentioned earlier as an example of Jewish flourishing in Enlightenment Germany. But he struggled all his life to balance his Jewish identity with his philosophical commitments. In his landmark book, Jerusalem, he insisted that it was possible to be both a modern thinker and an Orthodox Jew. This was his advice to his fellow Jews. Adapt yourselves to the morals and the constitution of the land to which you have been removed, but hold fast to the religion of your fathers too. Bear both burdens as well as you can. Remain unflinchingly at the post to which Providence has assigned you, and endure everything that happens to you, as your lawgiver foretold long ago. But that double burden that he speaks of being German and being Jewish, turned out to be heavier than Mendelssohn's own children wanted to bear. Most of them converted to Christianity, and all of his grandchildren were raised as Christians. One of those grandchildren, of course, was Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, the great composer, who became famous in part for his production of Christian sacred music, oratorios on biblical subjects and choral settings of psalms. Mendelssohn identified himself as a Christian and a Christian artist. But surely we want to think in some way the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn remained by inheritance, by family background, by culture, a Jewish artist. And yet in the 19th century, the idea that Mendelssohn was a Jewish composer was not a compliment or an interesting subject for inquiry. It was rather a charge leveled against him by musical anti-Semites who refused to believe that a Jew could ever truly enter into the spirit of German music. That was the argument made by Wagner in his notorious essay, Judaism and Music, where he writes, Mendelssohn has shown us that a Jew may have the amplest store of specific talents, may own the finest and most varied culture, the highest and tenderest sense of honor, yet without all these preeminences helping him, were it but one single time, to call forth in us that deep, heart-searching effect which we await from art, because we know her capable of it, because we have felt it many a time as soon as once a hero of our art has, so to say, but opened his mouth to speak to us. Wagner is certain that a Jew can never be a hero of art because he can never escape Jewishness. The Jew, he writes, speaks the language of the nation in whose midst he dwells from generation to generation, but he speaks it always as an alien. In other words, Wagner is championing the idea that a Jewish mind is always identifiable as Jewish by its products, that there's some essence of Jewishness that makes Mendelssohn a Jewish artist, despite his Christianity. And this Jewishness, of course, for Wagner is not just different, but inferior. What issues from the Jews' attempts at making art must necessarily, therefore, bear the attributes of coldness and indifference, even to triviality and absurdity. And in the history of modern music, we can but class the Judaic period as that of final unproductivity, of stability gone to ruin. This idea was not confined to Wagner's essays, but even made its way into his operas. In The Master Singers of Nuremberg, there's a portrait of a bad composer named Beckmesser, whose harsh, incompetent, tone-deaf songs demonstrate all those musical disabilities that Wagner associates with Jews. So clearly, it's problematic to speak of Jewish music. The expression has an ugly history, and it involves us in all kinds of quandaries about Jewish difference. It's against this background, however, that I wanted to circle back to the question with which I began. Is there such a thing as Jewish literature? In other words, is there some quality that unites different forms of literary expression by Jews across barriers of time and language and culture? To be more concrete, do a story in German by Kafka, an essay in English by Susan Sontag, and a novel in Hebrew by Amos Oz all belong in the same category? What about if we add to that category the Bible or the Talmud? Is there any meaningful way in which these are all Jewish works, other than the trivial fact that they were all written by Jews? One possible answer to that question, as we've already seen, is that there's something distinctive about the way Jews relate to texts. If textual study is the core of Judaism, and historically that's exactly what Jewish education meant, then perhaps a deep involvement with texts is itself enough to make those who practice it part of Jewish tradition. This idea has been popular among modern American Jewish intellectuals, who've often taken intellectuality itself to be a form of Jewish practice. Harold Rosenberg, the art critic who was a charter member of the New York Intellectuals, proudly remarked, "For 2,000 years, the main energies of Jewish communities have gone into the mass production of intellectuals." The implication is that a Jew who spends his life studying Talmud and a Jew who spends his life studying the poems of T.S. Eliot or the novels of Henry James are essentially doing the same thing. Both are engaged in a Jewish activity, interpretation, the discovery of meanings in texts. That's a reassuring idea for an assimilated American Jew, since it seems to make it possible to be authentically Jewish without knowing anything in particular about Judaism. But Lionel Trilling, the literary critic who, like Rosenberg, was an archetypal New York intellectual, didn't believe that merely being an interpreter of texts was enough to qualify him as a Jewish writer. "It is clear to me," he wrote, "that my existence as a Jew is one of the shaping conditions of my temperament, and therefore I suppose it must have its effect on my intellect. Yet I cannot discover anything in my professional intellectual life which I can specifically trace back to my Jewish birth and rearing. I do not think of myself as a Jewish writer. I do not have in mind to serve by my writing any Jewish purpose. I should resent it if a critic of my work were to discover in it either faults or virtues which he called Jewish." Was Trilling correct? Or was he, simply by virtue of being a Jewish literary critic, a more Jewish writer than he knew? Obviously, the activity of literary criticism can't be considered distinctively Jewish. If it were, you'd have to claim everyone from Matthew Arnold to T.S. Eliot as in some sense Jewish writers. But perhaps there are particular forms of interpretation that have roots in Jewish tradition. Perhaps Jewishness is not so much a way of writing as a way of reading. The only way to answer that question, however, is to look at canonical Jewish commentaries and interpreters to see what kind of role interpretation has traditionally played in Judaism. And of course, that's an enormous subject, which is far beyond the scope of my abilities and knowledge or tonight's lecture. But I wanted to take just a few examples of traditional Jewish interpretation to see what they look like and what, if anything, we could deduce from them. Take, for example, the way the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud interpret the Purim story from the book of Esther in Tractate Megillah. In chapter 6 of Esther, we read about how King Ahasuerus, unable to sleep one night, orders his servant to read to him from the royal book of Chronicles. He happens to listen to a passage about how Mordecai, the uncle of Queen Esther, once foiled a plot against the king's life. Realizing that Mordecai has never been rewarded for this service, the king asks Haman for advice. You all know this story, and this is how it reads in the book of Esther. "And he answered the king, 'For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides upon, and the crown which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and this horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' Then the king said to Haman, 'Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sits at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken.' Then Haman took the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor." That incident marks the turning point in the book of Esther. Haman, who has been plotting to murder Mordecai, and with him all the Jews of the Persian Empire, finds himself forced to honor Mordecai instead. And soon, thanks to Esther's intervention, his plans against the Jews will also be thwarted. Now, when the rabbis of the Talmud come to recount this moment in the story, they take such delight in Haman's humiliation that they add new details not found in the biblical text in order to heighten and prolong it. Before Mordecai can mount the king's horse, for example, he informs Haman that he must visit the bathhouse and trim his hair, for he says it is not proper conduct to use the king's garments in this state. In the meantime, however, Esther has sent messengers to all the bathhouses in the city ordering them to close. So Haman has no choice but to do the job himself. And this is the Talmud. He took Mordecai into the bathhouse and washed him, and he went and brought scissors from his house and trimmed his hair. While he was trimming his hair, he injured himself and sighed. Mordecai said to him, "Why do you sigh?" Haman said to him, "The man whom the king had once regarded above all his other ministers is now made a bathhouse attendant and a barber." So the places have been reversed. Instead of Mordecai being ordered to bow before Haman, now Haman has to perform the menial task of cutting Mordecai's hair. But Mordecai gets in one further jab. "Wicked man," he says, "were you not once the barber of the village of Kartstum? For it was taught, Haman was the barber of the village of Kartstum for 22 years. Now, there's nothing about Haman being a barber in the book of Esther. This is a gratuitous insult to his social status, designed to further his humiliation. It reads very much as if the rabbis were rubbing it in, inventing new ordeals for Haman in order to glory in the defeat of the Jews' worst enemy. But it's significant that the Talmud itself doesn't believe that it's adding to or interfering with the biblical story. Rather, the detail about Haman being a barber is something that was taught. To be valid, any addition to the text must not be an invention, but a genuine fact handed down from time immemorial. This happens even more dramatically when the rabbis reach the line, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Listen to what happens in the Talmud, though not again in the book of Esther itself. As Haman was taking Mordecai along the street of Haman's house, Haman's daughter was standing on the roof and saw the spectacle. She thought to herself that the one who was riding on the horse must be her father, and the one walking before him must be Mordecai. So she took a chamber pot and cast its contents onto the head of her father, whom she mistakenly took to be Mordecai. When Haman raised his eyes, she saw that he was her father, and in her distress she fell from the roof to the ground and died. This is a wonderfully gross example of literary vengeance. The humiliation of Haman, already implicit in the whole situation, is compounded by having him be covered in excrement, and then his daughter gets killed off to boot. But how do the rabbis justify this addition to the biblical story? The answer is given by Rav Sheshet, who points to one verse from the original book of Esther, which reads, "Haman hastened to his house, mourning and having his head covered." Now, in the original context, it seems plain that his mourning and his disguise are simply because he's embarrassed at having been seen in public as Mordecai's inferior. But Sheshet seizes on the biblical phrasing and seeks to expand on it. If Haman is mourning, surely it's because someone has died. And if he has his head covered, surely it's because there's something objectionable on his head. The story of the chamber pot and the dead daughter fits the bill exactly. This is not to say that the story was invented to meet the requirements of the verse. Perhaps the story came first and the verse was adduced later to give it legitimacy. But Rav Sheshet's remark does give us a vivid and fascinating example of one kind of rabbinic interpretation, Midrash. A biblical story is not necessarily complete. By attending to the exact words and expressions it uses, we can extrapolate other details that fit the spirit and intention of the story. This kind of midrash is seen not as violating the integrity of the biblical text, but as completing it. At the same time, midrash can end up contradicting or even erasing the biblical text if for some reason the rabbis find the Bible's account objectionable on moral or theological grounds. Take, for instance, the very brief account in Genesis chapter 35 about Reuben, the oldest of Jacob's 12 sons. "And it came to pass while Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and he lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard." That's the whole story, a single verse. It's not mentioned again until the end of the book of Genesis, when the dying Jacob curses Reuben by saying, "Unstable as water, you shall not excel because you went up to your father's bed and defiled it. He went up to my couch." Now, there would seem to be no ambiguity in this story. Reuben had sex with Bilhah, which is practically incest, since she was his father's bedmate. But when Rashi came to annotate this verse, he explained that Reuben did no such thing. Actually, what he did was simply to move his father's bed, taking it out of Bilhah's tent in order to put it in the tent of his own mother, Leah, Jacob's first wife. As Rashi says, as a result of the fact that Reuben disturbed the location of Jacob's bed, Scripture treats him as if he had lain with her, with Bilhah. And why did Reuben disturb and desecrate Jacob's couch? Because when Rachel died, Jacob took his bed, which had regularly been situated in the tent of Rachel, and put it into the tent of Bilhah. Reuben came and demanded satisfaction for the insult to his mother Leah. He said, "If my mother's sister was a rival of my mother, how should my mother's sister's handmaiden be a rival of my mother?" This is why he disturbed the location of Jacob's bed. In this way, this long exegetical tradition that Rashi is drawing on evacuates the literal meaning of the biblical text. Reuben, the patriarch's son, namesake of one of the 12 tribes, was surely too righteous a man to do something as sinful as sleeping with his father's concubine. it follows that that cannot be what the Bible meant. It must have meant something else. And the story Rashi offers reflects much better on Reuben. Now he is motivated not by transgressive lust, but by a noble desire to protect his mother's rights. This kind of midrash is very free with the literal meaning of the biblical text, but only in the service of what it sees as a higher kind of truth. It tells us what the Bible must have meant, what it ought to have meant, if it is to be the kind of book piety expects it to be. The idea that the biblical authors were less pious than their rabbinic readers, that the Bible countenances a lot of behavior that would have appeared sinful to later readers, is a modern insight that the rabbis don't share. To look at these classic examples of Jewish exegesis is to recognize that despite what Harold Rosenberg might think, there's no real similarity between what the rabbis meant by interpretation and what a contemporary secular literary critic means by it. When the rabbis interpret a sacred text, they do so in a paradoxical way. They're at the same time far more reverential toward it than we are toward any literary text, and also far more free and creative in their reading. This is because a biblical story is, in the traditional view, authored by God, and a text of divine origin must be as infinite as its author. It's impossible to read anything into such a text because it already contains every conceivable meaning. With a literary text, on the other hand, the critic's interpretation must stay within the boundaries defined by genre, language, and authorial intention. A reader of Henry James, who invented new details in the life of Isabel Archer, The Portrait of a Lady, the way Rav Sheshet invented new details in the Esther story, would be considered a very irresponsible critic. Is it possible, then, for a modern secular Jewish writer to appropriate this tradition, to make use of it in an authentic way? One answer is provided by the work of Walter Benjamin, the highly influential German Jewish critic whose essays on literature and mass media are some of the foundational texts of modernism. Benjamin's relationship to his own Jewish heritage was problematic. Raised in a secular home, he knew almost nothing about Judaism as a religion and identified strongly with the German literary tradition. Yet his friendship with Gershom Scholem, who would go on to become the leading modern scholar of Jewish mysticism, introduced Benjamin to some of the key concepts of Jewish tradition, including the idea of God as an author who uses language to create the world. In his famous essay, The Task of the Translator, Benjamin draws on this tradition to develop a radical theory of language and translation. He writes, "Translation is a form. To comprehend it as a form, we must go back to the original, for the laws governing the translation lie within the original, contained in the issue of its translatability. The question of whether a work is translatable has a dual meaning. Either will an adequate translator ever be found among the totality of its readers, or, more pertinently, does its nature lend itself to translation, and therefore, in view of the significance of this form, call for it. Only superficial thinking will deny the independent meaning of the latter question and declare both to be of equal significance. It should be pointed out, in refutation of such thinking, that certain concepts retain their meaning and possibly their foremost significance, even if they are not, from the outset, used exclusively with reference to man. One might, for example, speak of an unforgettable life or moment, even if all men had forgotten it. If the nature of such a life or moment required that it be unforgotten, the predicate would imply not a falsehood, but merely a claim unfulfilled by men, and probably also a reference to a realm in which it is fulfilled, God's remembrance. Analogously, the translatability of linguistic creations ought to be considered even if men were to prove unable to translate them. Given a strict concept of translation, would they not really be translatable to some degree? The question as to whether the translation of certain linguistic creations is called for ought to be posed in this sense. In other words, what Benjamin is saying is a text might never successfully be interpreted by human beings, but in principle it remains interpretable because there is a perspective, God's perspective, from which the fullness of its meaning can be seen. This is a frankly mystical conception of language, and it has a deep affiliation, it seems to me, with the way the rabbis read Scripture. For the rabbis, too, the interpretability of texts was guaranteed by their divinity. Benjamin's radicalism lies in the way he extends this interpretability even to human texts, to works of secular literature. All language, not just sacred language, has a divine and infinite dimension. so that translation becomes a kind of priestly task. The difference is that while the rabbis had confidence that their own interpretations were authorized by God, that what they said about people like Haman and Reuben was true, a secular interpreter can have no such certainty. What Benjamin is dramatizing here, then, is the rupture of a tradition. Benjamin places himself in the lineage of Jewish textual interpreters, not simply because he's a Jew who happens to be a literary critic, like maybe Lionel Trilling, but because he takes seriously the metaphysical principles that governed Jewish exegesis. Yet he speaks as one who has inherited the form of that tradition without its content. He knows that the importance of interpretation is infinite, but he's no longer sure that he's actually able to find a correct interpretation. Elsewhere in his work, this principle is extended from literary texts to all of creation. In an explicitly mystical early essay titled On Language as Such and the Language of Man, he writes, "All communication of the contents of the mind is language. Communication in words is only a particular case of human language and of the justice, poetry, or whatever underlying it or founded on it. The existence of language, however, is coextensive not only with all the areas of human mental expression, but with absolutely everything. There is no event or thing in either animate or inanimate nature that does not in some way partake of language." A Kabbalist might say the same thing, but the traditional Jewish mystic believed that it was possible to read the words of nature because they were the words, literally the Hebrew letters, with which God created the universe. For Benjamin, this communication is broken. We live in a world constituted by a language we cannot read. That has a very Kafkaesque sound, and it's no coincidence that Benjamin became one of Franz Kafka's early critical champions. Both emerged from the German-speaking Jewish bourgeoisie in the early 20th century, a time of deep crisis in the Jewish world, with war and persecution on the rise, and the Holocaust just over the horizon. So it makes sense that Kafka, like Benjamin, was especially attuned to the idea of a fractured tradition and blocked interpretation. This idea is everywhere in his fiction, but probably its most vivid and celebrated expression comes in the section of the trial known as Before the Law. In this episode, a priest tells Joseph K., the man wanted for an unknown crime, an ancient story about a man who seeks admittance to the law. But the door to the law is guarded by a doorkeeper who refuses to let him in. This man spends his entire life waiting for the door to be opened, but it never is. And finally, when he's dying, he asks the doorkeeper why, in all that time, he has never seen another person asked to be allowed in. "No one but you could gain admittance through this door, since this door was intended only for you," the doorkeeper replies. "I am now going to shut it." In this story, Kafka never explains just what the law is or what it might mean to gain admittance to it. But it's unmistakable that the law, the Torah, is the center of Judaism, the thing that Jews had studied for generations. And Kafka's pilgrim, unable to find his way into the law, resembles the modern Jew who has no point of entry into Jewish tradition. The Jewish resonance of this parable is made almost explicit in the following pages, when Joseph K. engages the priest in a long and fruitless conversation, attempting to interpret the story and figure out what it's trying to say. "The scriptures are unalterable," the priest remarks, and the comments on them often enough merely express the commentator's bewilderment. This is a scene of failed interpretation, of a scripture that refuses to give up its secrets. Yet by engaging in the process of dialectic, asking questions and ruling out alternatives, Joseph K. seems to be enacting in a failed, parodic form the kind of argument that fuels scriptural analysis in the Talmud. In traditional Midrash, Walter Benjamin pointed out, the story lies down at the feet of doctrine. The interpreter reads texts in order to make them conform with religious truth, as we saw in these earlier examples. But in Kafka, Benjamin went on, the story, having crouched down, unexpectedly cuffs doctrine with a weighty paw. This resistance to, or refusal of interpretation, is what makes Kafka's work read like a parable with a missing key, an allegory of something no one can quite name. And this situation, which is so Jewish in origin and in conception, proved to be so universal in experience in the 20th century that Kafka's name was turned into an adjective in order to name it. As always, the local dimension of literature proves to be not an enemy of the universal, but the surest way of reaching the universal. So does that mean that the only authentic Jewish literature today is literature about the failure of Judaism? That would be much too pessimistic a conclusion. Rather, the case of Kafka suggests that what makes literature Jewish is its decision to engage with Jewish texts, traditions, and vocabularies, even in a negative way. Doing this does not require an extensive knowledge of Jewish tradition, which neither Benjamin nor Kafka possessed, but it does require an instinct for finding the elements in that tradition which can be used, or maybe even misused, in order to communicate a modern truth. The writer Leon Wieseltier captured this relationship to tradition in a beautiful metaphor. Tradition is not reproduced, it is thrown and caught. It lives a long time in the air. Jewish literature is what happens every time a writer reaches out to make that catch. Thank you. And I'd be happy to take questions if there's time for them. Sure. If anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Yes?
So if I understand it, from your point of view, it's the positive, negative struggle with those ancient texts, however vaguely understood during the period. But it's not a particular form of writing, stance. It's not for a lot of people, sort of Jewish literature is some form of alienated literature. You would reject that. It really has to do with content. And so, just take an example that comes to mind. So, Nolan the Natural is not a Jewish text.
Well, you could say that it is in its very determination not to be, right? That's sort of the Natural about a baseball player is a book that tries so hard to be American and is so affirmatively American that you start to feel like there's something fishy going on. And if you put it in the context of all of Malamud's work, it starts to look different. So I'd say that the alienation and the content are, those two things are alternatives. I would think they're probably linked in some way, and that's why I used Kafka as an example, because if the situation of most modern secular Jews is to be alienated from Jewish tradition, then that alienation provides a model for engaging with the world. And because so many people are alienated from their traditions in so many ways, that Jewish alienation becomes then a way of engaging with everyone. And so you see alienation, of course, not just in Jewish literature, it's all over the place in modern literature, but that Jewish experience becomes a gateway to the universal. Yes?
So in talking about interpretations, I was waiting for you to talk about Freud.
Yes. Sure, no, I could have definitely talked about Freud. I mean, Freud is another great example, along with Kafka, contemporaneous with Kafka, and coming out of much the same situation, of someone who is inventing a new kind of interpretation, maybe to make up for the absence of traditional interpretation. You could say the same thing about Marx in the way that he interprets history. I mean, these are the sort of the people who interpret the modern world to us are so often Jews who come from a tradition of interpretation that's been ruptured, and so they have to find new ways of interpreting. And that is sort of what puts them at the center of the modern experience.
I was wondering along with that, it almost seems like Freud was teaching medicine Talmud, so, and interpretation. So anyway, your talk was lovely.
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting, and it raises the question of how someone who never read the Talmud can be considered part of this tradition, and there must be mechanisms of transmission that aren't obvious.
But I think he did have Talmud.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, I think his father, I think it was a Jewish house.
No, in that case, there's an answer.
No? I don't know.
I didn't think so, but I don't know to consult our Peter again.
Yeah, me too.
Other questions? Yeah?
Oh, just as a really quick and basic question. I really didn't catch the name of the scholar you were talking about, Solomon Maimon, or Maimon, how do you spell it?
Like Maimonides, M-A-I-M-O-N.
And was he a follower or a precursor of Moses Mendelssohn?
He was a follower. They were contemporaries, and Mendelssohn sort of came to Berlin and made a big success and established himself, and then, as Maimon himself says in his autobiography, all the other Jews who came to Berlin trying to establish themselves would go to Mendelssohn and ask for help. And that's what Maimon did. He was sort of someone who wanted to follow in Mendelssohn's footsteps.
Did he differentiate himself from Mendelssohn, or was he?
He thought of himself as much less polished, which he was. He was someone who couldn't make it in the salons and in that sort of refined world. He was much more a product of the traditional Eastern European village. And in this autobiography, which is such a fascinating book, he writes a lot about how he would go to different German cities trying to find a way to make a living as an intellectual, basically. And the only way he could make a living was as a Talmud teacher, because that's what the Jews wanted him to be. And he would do things like go to dinner at someone's house and refuse to say the brachot and say, I don't believe in an anthropomorphic God, so I won't say them, and get kicked out, and then he'd have to go somewhere else. So he's sort of a fascinating example of someone between these two worlds of tradition and modernity.
Of Jewish texts, what I've always found to be the most curious story is the tradition that, in addition to the complete tablets of the law, the broken tablets were also retained as well. Do you find a similar dialectic in relationship to Jewish literature?
That's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this Jewish relationship to text is if you look at the way the Torah was expanded and made the basis of a legal system in the Talmud, and then made the basis of a mystical system, and all of it going back to this one book, you see that this sense that the book that we have is just one version of the Torah, right? And that there's much more in it than you could get just from sitting down and reading it, which is one reason why the Jewish relationship to the Bible is so different from the Protestant relationship to the Bible, that it's not unmediated, it's always mediated by some kind of interpretation. And that is, in a way, very un-American, because the American relationship with the Bible tends to be coming from that Protestant tradition of direct confrontation. And it's maybe one way in which Jews stand at an angle to American literature.
I think it's also a weasel to your quote, that we need to have yeshivas in order to have open coursing. And so I'm curious whether you think like the maintenance of Orthodox Judaism is necessary for the conditions of production of Jewish literature that you're describing.
That's a very good question. I mean, there is a theory that the big creative explosions in Jewish history come at those moments of assimilation, and then those who assimilate disappear, the core remains until there's another encounter with the foreign culture, and then another creative flowering takes place. I think that is probably maybe too pessimistic. I think that American Jewish literature, just to look at it from that point of view, remains something identifiable even today, 100 years after American Jewish experience really sort of took off, or maybe 120, 130 years. And there are many predictions that it would cease to exist, but it still does exist. And in fact, I think you might even make a case that the younger generation of American Jewish writers is much more interested in Jewish tradition and texts than the classics of that tradition, than the classics of American Jewish literature. So you have people like Jonathan Safran Foer, who edited Haggadah, which you can't exactly imagine Philip Roth doing, right? It's a whole different relationship to tradition, and maybe a more affirmative one.
But he also, like Jonathan Safran Foer, I met him, he grew up religious, right? Like, so.
I don't think he grew up very religious.
But like in a house that was engaged directly with Judaism, like
yes.
The way that, for example, you described Mendelssohn as Mendelssohn's grandchildren was not happening.
Right. Yes. I mean, I think that there's the middle ground between orthodoxy and complete ignorance that probably most American Jews occupy, or at least a good proportion of them. All right. Thank you very much.